I'd like to show you all something. So this is a picture of tablet K3375. It's a cuneiform tablet in the British Museum. It was found in Iraq in the 19th century, and it tells a portion of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood narrative. Though this tablet isn't that old, the Epic of Gilgamesh was composed sometime between 1800 and 2000 BCE, so roughly 4,000 years ago. It tells the mythologized tale of Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu. Gilgamesh himself appears to have been a real king of the city of Uruk in present-day Iraq. The Epic of Gilgamesh is widely believed to be the earliest surviving notable literature and the second oldest surviving religious text that we have. There's another story, I'm sorry I don't have an image of it, known as the Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor. It was written on papyrus in hieratic, writing system developed for ancient Egyptian. That story also dates from around 1800 BCE and is a story from ancient Egypt's Middle Kingdom. It tells the story of an Egyptian sailor shipwrecked on a distant island and the terrible and fantastic things that he witnesses there. It's probably our earliest written example of genre fiction as we think of it today. The original papyrus is in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. And this tablet, well, this is an image anyway, of Istanbul number 2461. And it contains, again in cuneiform, what we think is the oldest love poem ever found. And it's dating from about 2030 BCE. Now, what do these three things have in common? Well, aside from being really old, they're all poems. So, welcome to Storytime for Adults. This month, things are going to be slightly different. April is National Poetry Month, and this seems like a perfect time to branch out a little with our story times. But this is still story time, so I felt like I needed to show you all a link between what we think of as poetry today and where our oldest stories seem to come from. So the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor are both epic poems, stories told in poetic form. For that matter, so are two of the Western world's most famous stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Poetry appears to have been intimately linked with the stories that humans tell each other since long before the invention of writing. That appears to have been cuneiform, which was invented around 5,000 years ago, give or take. Poetry as a medium to tell stories isn't unique to the West or the Near East either, but appears to be a human universal. The Ramayana and Mahabharata, the two main bodies of myth from the Indian subcontinent, were both composed in Sanskrit as epic poems. Composing a story as poetry was and is a powerful mnemonic device that people all over the ancient world used as a means to help memorization of a story. And luckily for us, some of those stories were eventually written down. The Iliad and the Odyssey were both appear to have been composed and circulated in oral tradition for quite some time before being written down sometime in probably the 8th century BCE. W.E.B. Du Bois, the American historian, sociologist, and civil rights activist, once said in private correspondence, "This is a day when most people will not read poetry, which explains a good deal concerning our situation." Oof. Well, let's see if maybe we can rectify that just a little bit today, shall we? So where shall we start? Regrettably, we don't really have time to read any complete epic poems today, fun as that would be. But I do feel like we need to start off with something old and important and influential. That has kind of become my shtick, I guess. So our first poet was an archaic Greek poet writing in the 6th century before the Common Era. Widely credited with the invention of lyric poetry, as well as being the musician who invented the mixolydian mode, Sappho of Lesbos was so famous, and her poetry so loved in the ancient world, that she was often simply referred to as the poetess. To put that in perspective, when they referred to the poet, they were talking about Homer. And though we think he was probably a real person, we don't exactly know for sure. And the question is still contentious with some classicists. Plato, the father of Western philosophy, referred to her as the 10th muse. In ancient Greek mythology, the 9 muses were the immortal daughters of Zeus and said to inspire all arts and human endeavors. And Plato compared Sappho to them. Solon, the famous Athenian politician of Solon's Law Code, and the first recorded writer of political propaganda, in the form of poetry no less, is said to have once heard someone play one of Sappho's songs at a drinking party. He reportedly loved it so much that he asked to be taught to play it. And when asked by his son why, he said, "So once I learn it, I may die." The story is admittedly almost surely apocryphal, but the fact that such a story could be circulated about Sappho's poetry tells us just how high in esteem they held her in. So Sappho was born on the island of Lesbos in the eastern Aegean, sometime around 630 BCE, to an aristocratic family. As I said above, she was widely credited in the ancient world as the inventor and one of the most prolific practitioners of lyric poetry. Well, what is that exactly? It's poetry that was accompanied by the lyre, and it's where we get the English word lyric in its common usage, as in a song lyric. Yeah, that was Sappho. Poetry is set in meter to music. Now, biographical details about Sappho's life are extremely slim. This is because biography as we think of it today wasn't really a thing in the Greek world at that time. Now, we know that she had a daughter named Cleis. We know she was exiled to Sicily twice in her life for her political views, and that she reportedly died there. She may have had a husband at some point, and she may have had 3 brothers. She was loved and famous enough for statues to have been carved of her and coins minted with her name and face on them. Of course, the most famous thing about Sappho is that she's where we get the English words sapphic, describing same-sex attraction between women, and lesbian. She is history's most famous lesbian, and a major gay icon. The truth of her life may well have been more complicated, of course. In the ancient Greek world, homosexuality was not something that you were. It was not an identity class, but rather it was something people did. We know, after all, from fragments that she had a daughter. But frankly, a lot of the details of her life are simply lost to time. We think she died sometime around 570 BCE, but the only report we have of how she died is from centuries later, and almost surely a fiction. Much of what we know, or think we know about Sappho, comes from her poems and ancient sources that had access to material of hers and about her that we just don't have today. Sappho is reported by ancient sources to have written some 10,000 lines of poetry in 9 volumes, and was widely copied and passed around the ancient world. Copies of her poems were in the Library of Alexandria when it burned under Julius Caesar. Today, however, we have only some 650 lines for poetry, and only 4 complete poems, 2 of which have been found since 2004. Most of what we have are fragments containing a sentence, maybe a stanza or a partial page, and sometimes only a word. But in what we have of Sappho, she gave us something that today we cannot even conceive of poetry without. She gave us the poetic I. That is the intimate first-person poem. I felt, I saw, I think, I love. When Homer and the authors of the Epic of Gilgamesh wrote, they reported what happened and what was said, but they never told us what they, the poet, thought or felt. Sappho does that, and if she wasn't the first Greek poet to do it, she's the first we know of and one of the most prolific. And boy, does she tell us how she felt. It is simply not possible to read her poetry, even the fragmentary stuff we have, and not draw the conclusions about her sexuality that people have been drawing for 26 centuries. Sometimes a cigar is really a cigar. So she was so popular, why do we have so little of her poetry? During the Renaissance and Romantic periods, poets like to say that it was the result of the early church burning her works because they thought it was evil and sinful. The truth, however, is sadder and a bit more prosaic. Her poetry was all written in a dialect called Aeolian Greek. By the 1st century, however, almost every Greek speaker spoke Koine Greek, and Sappho was as difficult for them to read as Beowulf is for us to read in the original Middle English. Beowulf is also an epic poem, by the way. So really, she got hard to read, and suddenly only scholars were reading and copying her work. The process is called linguistic drift, and Sappho appears to have been a victim of it. So I've been going on for quite a bit here without reading you anything. Let's fix that, shall we? I mean, I've been building Sappho up for some 6 minutes now. It's kind of time to deliver. This first poem is actually a fragment. It's called Fragment 16. Some people refer to the poem by the title Some Say. Some say thronging cavalry. Some say foot soldiers. Others call a fleet the most beautiful of sights that dark earth offers. But I say it's whatever you love best. And it's easy to make this understood by anyone, for she who surpassed all humankind in beauty, Helen, abandoned her husband, that best of men, went sailing off to the shores of Troy, and never spent a thought for her child or loving parents. When the goddess seduced her wits and left her to wander, she forgot them all. She could not remember anything but longing, and lightly straying aside, lost her way. But that reminds me now of Anactoria. She's not here, and I'd rather see her lovely step her sparkling glance and her face, then gaze on all the troops in Lydia in their chariots and glittering armor. There's some controversy about this poem. Most scholars think that there's supposed to be at least one more stanza, but we don't know for sure. The ending we have now is abrupt, but you can still feel the power in it. When I said she told us how she felt, I meant it. And in this ancient snapshot of longing, we can see something else. There's a story here. Something came before that. So next up, we're going to read one of her most famous fragments. It's known as Fragment 31. Some scholars have referred to it as the hymn to Anactoria, that same woman from Fragment 16, but frankly, we just don't know who the subject of the poem is. But even as a fragment, this is famous for a reason. It's powerful. Just listen. That man seems to me to be equal to the gods, who is sitting opposite you and hears you nearby speaking sweetly and laughing delightfully, which indeed makes my heart flutter in my breast. For when I look at you, even for a short time, it's no longer possible for me to speak, but it's as if my tongue is broken and immediately a subtle fire has run over my skin. I cannot see anything with my eyes and my ears are buzzing. A cold sweat comes over me, trembling seizes me all over. I'm paler than grass and I seem nearly to have died. But everything must be endured since. And that's it. That last sentence is the first line of the 5th stanza. It isn't even complete. Where was this taking place? Was it a party or social gathering? A wedding, maybe? The subject's wedding? And who's the man? Is he just some guy, or is he someone more important than that? There's no clue, but there's undeniable power in that description. Sappho hears her talking across a room, looks at her, and is so struck she passes out. She compares the guy sitting next to her to a god just because he's able to sit next to her. I mean, if that isn't flattery of a subject, I'm not sure what is. So most of what we have about Sappho is like this: fragments, incomplete poems. But even these fragments speak volumes to us. And remember, as powerful as these are, in the original Aeolian Greek, they would have rhymed and been in Sapphic meter, which she invented. 3 lines of 11 beats, followed by a 4th line of 5 beats. And they would have been set to music. All that imagery and feeling, rhyming in meter to music. It's not hard to imagine why the ancient Greeks were gaga for her. Let's read one more. This is one of only 4 complete poems of hers that we have. And as I said above, 2 of those poems were only discovered in the last 20 years. So this poem's titled Ode to Aphrodite. That was Goddess of Love. We know that's its title and that it's complete because it was preserved in Dionysius of Halicarnassus's On Composition. He quotes it in its entirety as an example of smooth, polished writing. Iridescent throned Aphrodite, deathless child of Zeus, wile weaver, I now implore you, don't, I beg you, lady, with pains and torments, crush down my spirit. But before, if ever you've heard my pleadings, then return. At once, when you left your father's golden house, you yoked to your shining car your wing-whirring sparrows. Skimming down the paths of the sky's bright ether, on they brought you over the earth's black bosom. Swiftly, then you stood with a sudden brilliance, goddess before me. Deathless face alight with your smile, you asked me what I suffered. Who was my cause of anguish? What would ease the pain of my frantic mind, and why I had called you to my side? And whom should persuasion summon here to soothe the sting of your passion this time? Who is now abusing you, Sappho? Who is treating you cruelly? Now she runs away, but she'll soon pursue you. Gifts she now rejects, soon enough she'll give them. Now she doesn't love you, but soon her heart will burn, though unwilling. Come to me once more and abate my torment. Take the bitter care from my mind and give me all I long for. Lady, in all my battles, fight as my comrade. Obviously, she's pining for someone. Clearly another woman. And in this poem, Sappho actually names herself as the narrator. If you're waiting for that hard proof from Sappho, here you go, guys. But parts of this are funny as well, right? I mean, Aphrodite teases her a little bit. Who's now abusing you, Sappho? we kind of get the impression from the poem that this sort of imploring to the goddess of love is kind of a regular thing for Sappho. And since she's the author, she's earnestly making fun of herself 26 centuries ago. It seems that most of what we are left with of Sappho that is definitive are her feelings, as expressed in her poetry and the fragments that we have. Reading her work, I don't think she'd be mad about that. Now, honestly, all of Sappho's stuff is pretty fabulous, and I would highly recommend for you to seek out her work. All of it that we have can be found online somewhere, including the newer discoveries. And I think we will have Sappho leave us with just one more little fragment before moving on to our next poet. The muses have filled my life with delight, and when I die, I shall not be forgotten. Going forward from here, I'm going to be giving us far shorter biographical intros, just a paragraph or two, since that'll give us more time for the poems. And we got a few people we want to make it through today. So for our second author of the evening, we're going to be taking a bit of a leap forward in time, until a point in history when the writing was done in an English that's more intelligible to us today. An English actor, poet, and playwright, William Shakespeare is widely regarded as the greatest writer in the English language and one of the greatest dramatists to have ever put pen to paper. Everyone has heard of him for a reason, and much like Sappho, he too has a single-word moniker that he's often been called, the Bard. Shakespeare was born the son of a successful alderman and glover in Stratford-upon-Avon in Elizabethan England, and baptized on April 26, 1564. We don't know his precise birth date, but it's generally been believed to be on or about April 23rd. Biographies of Shakespeare from the 18th century on have found that date appealing, since it's the exact same day he died on in 1616. Shakespeare was the third of 8 children and the oldest surviving son. He married an older woman, Anne Hathaway, at 18 years old and started a family. In 1592, he began his career as a playwright and actor with the company The Lord Chamberlain's Men, later called the King's Men, of which he was a part owner. He appears to have retired from writing and acting to his home in Stratford-upon-Avon, aged 49, in 1613, where he died just 3 years later. Though much of his work had been published to great success during his lifetime, in 1623, 2 of Shakespeare's friends and fellow actors published a collection of his plays that included all but 2 of them. It was titled The First Folio, and it had a poem as its preface. Poems again, guys, in which Ben Jonson first referred to Shakespeare with the now epically famous line, "Not of an age, but for all time." Shakespeare actually wrote a couple of very quite good epic poems of his own, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucretia. However, at several hundred and then well over 1,000 lines each, they're a bit long for us to read tonight. Check them out, however. Now, tonight we'll be reading 3 of Shakespeare's sonnets, each notable for different reasons. Let's start with Sonnet 94. They that have power to hurt and will do none, they that do not do the thing they do show, who moving others are themselves as stone, unmoved, cold, and to temptation slow. They rightly do inherit heaven's graces, and husband nature's riches from expense. They are the lords and owners of their faces, others but stewards of their excellence. The summer's flowers is to the summer sweet, though to itself is only live and die. But if that flower with base infection meet, the basest weed outbraves his dignity. For sweetest things turn sourest by their deeds. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. The sonnet starts out, the first 8 lines anyway, praising a certain kind of very controlled, restrained person, someone who's slow to temptation and seemingly unaffected by outside influence. But then he switches on us. The flower makes summer sweet, but the flower doesn't think itself terribly important. If it gets sick and rots, though, well, it smells far worse than weeds. Shakespeare seems to be ruminating on goodness and telling us that ultimately it's our behavior that determines how sweet we are, even implying that those who were once virtuous, lilies, and have fallen, are far worse off than those who were not distinguished to start with. So a sonnet, not a love poem. Let's look at another, shall we? Sonnet number 60. Like as the wave make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. each changing place with that which goes before. In subsequent toil all forwards do contend. Nativity, once in the main of light, crawls to maturity, where with being crowned, crooked eclipses 'gainst this glory fight, and time that gave doth now his gift confound. Time doth transfix the flourish set on youth, and delves the parallels in beauty's brow, feeds on the rarities of nature's truth, and nothing stands but for this scythe to mow. And yet, to times and hope my verse shall stand, praising thy worth despite his cruel hand. Another sonnet and not a flowery love poem? What's going on here? If you thought Shakespeare kept his meditations on life, loss, and the inevitability of death to his plays, well, I have news for you, he didn't. This particular sonnet is actually considered to be one of Shakespeare's greatest, in large part because it deals with those universal concerns of time and the inevitability of its passage. And Shakespeare's imagery here is vivid and classic, and yet at the end, there's this promise to immortalize the youth through the poem itself. All right, so third time's the charm, I suppose. Third sonnet, and yes, this one's a love poem, and yes, it's probably the one you were expecting. It's an objectively great poem, after all. Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance of nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou own'st, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou grow'st. As long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives, and this gives life to thee. So sappy love poem, we all heard 1,000 times, right? Not so fast. Sure, he starts off comparing the subject of the poem to a summer's day, and then goes on to show how in every way they're better and more temperate. Flattery. But then he changes things up a bit, because unlike summer, the subject's beauty will never fade. And how? Well, in the same as the last sonnet, it will be preserved and last forever in the poem. That beauty will live as long as men can breathe or eyes can see. This isn't just a fawning love poem, it's a sort of promise as well. All right, so moving forward, we have several more poets and poems to visit and less time to do it in. Next up, an English poet, artist, and printmaker who lived his life largely in obscurity and poverty, yet rubbed shoulders with the likes of Mary Wollstonecraft and Thomas Paine, and is now considered to be one of the seminal figures in the art and literature of the Romantic Age. William Blake has been called far and away the greatest artist that Britain ever produced by the art critic Jonathan Jones. Blake was born on November 28, 1757 in Soho, London. The son of a hosier, he went to school only until the age of 10, and after that was taught at home by his mother, Catherine. Blake was a deeply religious child and man for his entire life, and Christian themes and motifs figured heavily in his art and writing. From a young age and for his entire life, William Blake also claimed to see visions, almost always with strong religious overtones. The face of God peering in his bedroom window at night, a tree full not of birds but angels, the devil himself on the stairs to the cellar in his house. He was not shy or quiet about these visions either, but spoke of them regularly to his friends and family. This led to the widespread belief that William Blake was, in the parlance of the day, quite mad. But in that madness was an artistic and poetic genius as well. Much of Blake's art took the forms of etchings, and he actually developed several techniques all of his own, and was a partner in a print shop. This business and occasional wealthy patrons were how Blake and his wife survived economically. William Blake died at home in the middle of a project to illustrate all of Dante's Inferno. Another epic poem. Are you seeing the theme? In the presence of his wife on August 12th, 1827. His wife would continue to sell several of his works after his death, but always claimed that she had to consult William before making a sale, and claimed that he came to her in both dreams and waking visions. Blake's work eventually was discovered by the Romantic painters like Dante Gabriele Rossetti, who were both heavily influenced by his work and enthusiastic advertisers for it. So more than a generation after his death, Blake finally began to receive the attention and accolades that he deserved. So we'll be reading two poems by Blake tonight. The first is probably his most well-known and recognized poem, The Tiger. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain? In what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? And when the stars threw down their spears and watered the heavens with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? This poem is actually the second of a two-part set, the first being The Lamb, in which Blake is meditating on creation and the creator, trying to understand how a kind creator who'd created the lamb, both literally and metaphorically, could also create a fearsome apex predator like the tiger. Almost everything came back to religion or theology for Blake, even if it was for the purposes of a moral lesson as well. Here's his second poem we're going to read tonight. A Poison Tree. I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe. I told it not, my wrath did grow. And I watered it in my fears, night and morning with my tears. And I sunned it with smiles, and with soft deceitful wiles. And it grew both day and night, till it bore an apple bright, and my foe beheld it shine, and he knew that it was mine. And into my garden stole, when the night had veiled the pole. In the morning glad I see my foe outstretched beneath the tree. This poem is generally believed to be an allegory about the dangers of bottling up one's emotions and cycles of violence and negativity that it leads to. The language is simple and almost childlike, and yet the imagery of his anger becoming a poisoned apple that kills his foe is anything but childlike. All right, next up we're going to do a famous couple. Not because they're not interesting and talented artists in each of their own rights, but rather because their art was so often referenced to the circumstances of their lives. Both considered major poets and writers in the English Romantic movement, Percy by Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley lived lives that were unconventional and downright scandalous by the mores of the day. Both were also close friends of the infamous Lord Byron, and both produced some of the finest and most notable works of the Romantic period. Percy for his poetry, and Mary for, among other writings, Frankenstein, which is widely considered the first modern science fiction novel. Percy by Shelley was born the eldest son of Sir Timothy Shelley, a Whig member of Parliament. Educated at Eton and eventually Oxford, Shelley did not fit in well with his classmates and was often viciously bullied at his boarding schools before college. He also acquired a reputation as an eccentric with an interest in science and the occult. While at Oxford, he anonymously authored several tracts, including one titled The Necessity of Atheism, and mailed copies to all the bishops and heads of colleges at Oxford. Shelley was called in, and after refusing to answer any questions about whether or not he had authored the tract, he was expelled from college, along with his friend and co-author Thomas Jefferson Hogg. Shelley eventually married his first wife, Harriet Westbrook, over the objections of both the bride's and groom's families. As a married couple, they were often apart from one another, and despite having children together, Percy described their marriage as heartless. In 1814, Shelley would meet his mentor, William Godwin's daughter, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, daughter of the aforementioned Mary Wollstonecraft. Within a matter of weeks, a romance had started between Percy and the young Mary, with Mary reportedly declaring her love for Percy at the site of her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft's grave. Percy was, of course, still married to Harriet. That fact and family outrage from all involved did not stop Percy and Mary from eloping together, however. After the death by suicide of Percy's first wife, they would eventually legally marry, and in 1818 went into exile together from England to the European continent. Frankenstein was written by Mary as a response to a challenge undertaken between herself, her husband, and Lord Byron to each write a story. Much like in group projects everywhere, Mary completed her story, but neither Percy nor Byron did. Mary claimed that the inspiration for Frankenstein came from a waking vision that she'd had while suffering a bout of insomnia. What most don't know is that insomnia was brought on in part by the death of her second child in infancy. She may also have been somewhat inspired by the stories surrounding the real Castle Frankenstein, whose ruins she'd recently toured, as well as its most famous last resident. Percy by Shelley would eventually drown at sea at the age of 29 in a boating accident in July of 1822, along with two friends. His body would wash up on the shore at Viareggio in Italy. Percy was cremated by his friends on the beach, pyre fashion, but Percy's heart, which appeared to be calcified, possibly from an earlier case of tuberculosis, did not burn. Percy's heart eventually made its way into Mary's keeping, and she's said to have carried it with her everywhere for years after his death. The heart was eventually found wrapped in the pages of Percy's first draft of the poem Adonis in Mary's desk drawer a year after her death from a brain tumor in 1851 at the age of 53. This is, of course, the barest sketch of either of their lives, and it's fair to say that they lived up to the reputation of the Romantic poets and friends of Lord Byron. So tonight I'll just be reading two poems, one from each of them. Neither are terribly long, but they're both powerfully evocative of Romantic poetry. First, let's hear from Percy, since he does exit the metaphorical scene first. Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." It would be almost insulting to discuss the message of this poem. I'll simply note that the romantic obsession with long-lost civilizations, mythic times, and the disintegration of all things is on full and unambiguous display here. And of course, Percy's telling us a story with this poem, a story that could contain others, and he's doing so in a very sparse word count. And next, let us hear from Mary. This is one of her more famous poems, but I selected it more because it seemed interesting in the context of her life with Percy, and well demonstrated that the Romantic poets were indeed the original and unchallenged proto-Goths. Stanzas by Mary Shelley. "O come to me in dreams, my love. I will not ask a dearer bliss. Come with the starry beams, my love, and press mine eyelids with thy kiss. 'Twas thus in ancient fables tell, love visited a Grecian maid, till she disturbed the sacred spell, and woke to find her hopes betrayed. But gentle sleep shall veil my sight, and Psyche's lamp shall darkling be, when in the visions of the night thou dost renew thy vows to me. Then come to me in dreams, my love. I will not ask a dearer bliss. Come with the starry beams, my love, and press my eyelids with thy kiss." All right. So for our last poet of this evening, we have somebody quite special. A painter, poet, visual artist, and first-generation immigrant. Kahlil Gibran is the third best-selling poet of all time, behind only Shakespeare and Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, and has been translated into more than 100 languages. Kahlil Gibran was born January 6, 1883, in the village of Bishari in the Mount Lebanon, Mustafarat, in the Ottoman Empire in modern-day Lebanon. Gibran was born to a Maronite Christian family, and his parents, Kahlil Saad Gibran and Camilla Rameh, went to great lengths to set an example of tolerance and pluralism for their children, refusing to perpetuate or tolerate any religious prejudice and bigotry in their daily lives. In 1891, Gibran's father was convicted of embezzlement and imprisoned. During the time of his prison term, his mother resolved to follow the example of her brother and move to America. In June of 1895, Camilla did just that, leaving for New York with Gibran, his two younger sisters, Sultana and Mariana, and Gibran's older half-brother, Boutros, eventually settling in Boston's South End, at that time the home of America's second-largest Syrian-Lebanese-American community. Gibran would largely be educated in Boston, including art courses, but he did return to Lebanon, this time Beirut, at 15, for 3 years to continue his studies and receive education in his native culture and language. From there, he went to Paris for some time before ultimately returning to Boston. In 1902 and 1903, Gibran would lose his sister Sultana and brother Boutros to tuberculosis and his mother to cancer, leaving the family of 5 as only Gibran and Mariana. A year later, in 1904, at age 21, Gibran would have his first of many art openings. He, of course, continued to travel and began publishing poetry. Gibran eventually died in St. Vincent's Hospital, Manhattan, on April 10th of 1931, having refused last rites. His cause of death was reported to be cirrhosis of the liver and tuberculosis in one lung. As per his wishes, his remains were eventually transported back to the village of his birth in Lebanon, where they still reside today. For quite some time, critics tended to ignore Gibran's poetry, since it did not fit easily into the Western literary and poetic tradition. His book, The Prophet, however, published in 1923, has gone on to become one of the best-selling books of all time, and along with Gibran's other books and paintings, has established him as a vital voice in American and world art and poetry. Reading Gibran's poetry, it's easy to understand why he's proven so popular, for there is power and dignity in his work that is both incredibly deep and yet accessible as well. So let's have a couple from Kahlil Gibran, shall we? On pain. Your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. Even as the stone of the fruit must break, that its heart may stand in the sun, so must you know pain. And you could keep your heart in wonder at the daily miracles of your life. Your pain would not seem less wondrous than your joy, and you would accept the seasons of your heart, even as you've always accepted the seasons that pass over your fields, and you would watch with serenity through the winters of your grief. Much of your pain is self-chosen. It is the bitter potion by which the physician within you heals your sick self. Therefore trust the physician and drink his remedy in silence and tranquility. For his hand, though heavy and hard, is guided by the tender hand of the unseen. And the cup he brings, though it burn your lips, has been fashioned by the clay which the potter has moistened with his own sacred tears. Kahlil Gibran often eschewed conventional verse format, notably in large sections of his most famous work, The Prophet, as in the poem above. Let's see another example of that, shall we? Talking. This appears in the form of narrative. And then a scholar said, "Speak of talking." And he answered, saying, "You talk when you cease to be at peace with your thoughts. And when you can no longer dwell in the solitude of your heart, you live in your lips. And sound is a diversion and a pastime. And in much of your talking, thinking is half murdered. For thought is a bird of space that in a cage of words many indeed unfold its wings but cannot fly. There are those among you who seek the talkative through fear of being alone. The silence of aloneness reveals to their eyes their naked selves, and they would escape. And there are those who talk, and without knowledge or forethought reveal a truth which they themselves do not understand. And there are those who have the truth within them, but they tell it not in words. In the bosom of such as these, the spirit dwells in rhythmic silence. When you meet your friend on the roadside or in the marketplace, let the spirit in you move your lips and direct your tongue. Let the voice within your voice speak to the ear of his ear. For his soul will keep the truth of your heart as the taste of the wine is remembered when the color is forgotten and the vessel is no more. Good poetry is, of course, often deeply philosophical and introspective. We can, of course, see that here. There's also a sort of strange optimism in much of Kahlil Gibran's writing, even in the worst of circumstances, that one often can't help but find uplifting and even a little inspiring and baffling. Speaking of which, let's have one more from Kahlil Gibran. One more for the evening. This one presented without any commentary at all. Defeat. Defeat. My defeat. My solitude and aloofness. You are dearer to me than 1,000 triumphs, and sweeter to my heart than all world glory. Defeat. My defeat. My self-knowledge and my defiance. Through you I know that I am yet young and swift of foot, and not to be trapped by withering laurels. And in you I have found aloneness, and the joy of being shunned and scorned. Defeat, my defeat, my shining sword and shield. In your eyes I have read that to be enthroned is to be enslaved, and to be understood is to be leveled down, and to be grasped is but to reach one's fullness, and like a ripe fruit to fall and be consumed. Defeat, my bold companion. You shall hear my songs and my cries and my silences, and none but you shall speak to me of the beating of wings and urging of seas, and of mountains that burn in the night, and you alone shall climb my steep and rocky soul. Defeat, my deathless courage. You and I shall laugh together with storm, and together we shall dig graves for all that die in us. And we shall stand in the sun with a will, and we shall be dangerous. So if you enjoyed the story time, please leave us a comment down below. Let us know what you thought. If you didn't enjoy it, let us know that too. And if you all did like this, it's always possible that we do it again sometime. After all, we didn't even really scratch the surface of important poets this evening. But of course, everything we wrote or read tonight was in the public domain, meaning that it had been published in 1925 or earlier, and none of these poets are with us any longer. So I'll try to bring this all full circle then and leave you with one more little fragment from Sappho. Someone will remember us, I say, even in another time. Have a good evening.